In this week's video, I'll be throwing and trimming these porcelain vase forms. These are a shape I already make in stoneware, which is the red clay body I'll soon be returning to. The base forms of these are simple. They're thrown as a thick cylinder, which is then pushed out to form a more bulbous shape before the distinct angles are pushed onto the exterior form. As always, this process begins with spiral wedging the clay. This procedure is one that I presume all my long-time viewers are well versed with. It's like kneading dough when making bread, but instead of trying to incorporate air, I'm folding the clay in such a way that any pocket of air is eliminated, and what's left is a perfectly smooth and even texture-wise lump of clay. In some instances, when I'm throwing, I take slip directly from the wheel head to use on the centering, or from the wheel tray itself, rather than from the bucket of water that sits up above my wheel. The lump of porcelain is slammed down onto the middle of the bat, and then it's thrown. This process at the beginning of coning up and down the clay numerous times helps to align all the particles, and in many ways it's just like wedging, but on the wheel. And I found that I need to do this a lot more when using porcelain, as compared to my grogged stoneware clay body that I normally use. I squeeze the lump up, applying pressure from either side with my palms as my fingers help to guide it. And then, as I force the lump of porcelain back down, I lean it over to one side, which causes the lump to gather neatly at the bottom rather than in my hands, which is what you'll experience if you push the cone directly downward. With every cone up and down, the clay feels like it's running more and more smoothly beneath my hands, and then once I feel the clay is ready, I can make a divot in the middle of the lump, and for this I use my index finger and my thumb. They push down together and form the base of the pot, and then with the pads of my fingers on my left hand, I spend a few moments just compressing the base. I run them back and forth across the bottom, which is about half a centimetre thick, and this compression along with the coning should prevent most S-cracks from occurring on the base as the pot dries out later on. I then force the walls up, back into a rough cylinder, and now I can begin to pull up the walls and properly shape the pot. The procedure you saw throughout the beginning of this process is one that needs to be repeated pretty much for every single pot thrown on the wheel. Once the clay has been centered and opened up, it can be thrown into all manner of forms, which means that having a good, really thorough grasp of those initial steps is vital when learning to throw on the wheel. As I pull up the walls, my fingers on the inside are pushing out that bulge you can see travelling up the pot, and beneath that lump, I position the side of my knuckle on my right hand, which forces the bulge upward as it slides up the exterior surface. This entire process has to be done with some kind of lubricant in order to stop the clay from sticking to your hands. With many stoneware clay bodies, or those that are highly grogged, which means that they contain a certain percentage of coarse particles. This can be either sand, or it can be pottery that's already been fired, that has been ground up to various different sizes and textures, which is then added back to the clay. This adds strength to the clay body, and it can prevent the clay from warping or cracking. And I've found that with clays that contain more grog, I can get away with using water to throw with, as opposed to slip, as the textured clay body sort of hangs onto the water that's placed onto it. Whereas with this porcelain, which contains no grog and is perfectly smooth, the water just seems to flow off, and it also degrades the clay at a much higher rate. So instead, when throwing porcelain, I use slip, which is essentially just very watered down porcelain. It clings to the surface of the pot much better, and it also tends to degrade the vessel a lot more slowly. Once the rough shape is more or less there, I begin collaring in the top to make the opening more narrow. I do this by throwing the clay inward, and then I use two hands to collar in the opening, starting from below and working my way up. I then remove the excess water from inside the vase, and now, as the opening is a bit too narrow for my hand, I can use a throwing stick, which I place inside, and with this I can push out the walls to create a more bellied form. I make sure that the end of the throwing stick has been wetted before placing it inside. That way it can flow across the walls of clay rather than simply sticking to them as it spins. On the outside, my hand follows where the pressure is being applied inside. It acts as both a guide, and it can also feel when the clay gets too thin. Now that I have a more bulbous form, which I'm happy with, I can begin to further refine certain elements of it. I push this rim section inward slightly to ensure that there's enough clay in this section to form a substantial rim. I don't want it to be mean and razor sharp at this point. I'd rather have a sturdy rim at this point to support the rest of the form, and then later, once the pot is leather hard, I can trim it down to be more delicate. It's also at this stage that I remove some of the excess clay from around the base. Ultimately, I want these to have quite a narrow base, but at the throwing stage, realistically, with bulbous forms, if you have a very narrow foot, at this point the whole form can become quite difficult to control, especially as I throw in quite distinct angles into the waist, shoulder and neck. This means that I purposefully leave the lower sections of the walls to be perhaps a bit thicker than they need be to support the form as a whole as it's being thrown. Then, once the pot is leather hard, I can trim it down to have more of a profile that I prefer. And ideally this is the sort of cross-section I like to aim for, and these are the 3 distinct lines that separate the angles I want on the pot. I hold my metal kidney in place and I push with my fingers outward against the metal edge, dividing the form into the distinct planes as shown before. And at this point, if I feel that the opening needs to be a little more narrow, I can still do that, and I tend to use the index finger of my right hand to push the clay inward, whilst always keeping some fingers on the inside, just to support it and to prevent it all from flopping inward, which is definitely something soft clay likes to do if given the chance when thrown thinly. I then use the kidney to define the top rim section, scraping away the slip on the exterior, and with the index finger on my left hand, I sort of roll the clay over to form a beveled edge. This makes the very tip of the rim appear sharp, whilst also maintaining some strength in the form. And finally, I drape a chamois leather over the rim just to soften it and smooth it out. I trim these extensively, so it doesn't really need this. It's more just a force of habit, more than anything. I sponge out any last droplets of water from inside, and then it's finally time to remove the pot from the wheel. I quickly clean up the bat and the surrounding area, and then I use a fine twisted metal wire to slide beneath the pot. I find that these textured wires make a much better separation between the pot and the bat, as compared to a piece of very smooth fishing twine, for instance, which would create such a smooth cut that the pot practically sticks back down onto the bat straight away again, whereas the thicker, more textured wire slices through in such a way that the 2 parts can't stick back together so easily. The following day, once these vases are more or less completely leather hard, they can be trimmed. The pots at this point can be handled and moved around without damaging them, whereas attempting to do this just after they've been thrown would leave you with a squashed pile of clay. Pots need this time of slowly drying out before they can be trimmed, and attempting to rush it, unless done very carefully, can cause the pot to crack and split. I brush some slip over the base and tap center it into the middle of the wheel. This is more or less the same slip I was throwing with, and it sort of acts like glue and helps hold the pot down firmly in place. And just for an added bit of security, I use a plastic kidney just to squash down a small portion of the porcelain into the metal wheel head, and then I can begin to trim. I remove a thin skim of clay from the entire pot, lightening the vessel and refining the shape. Porcelain, when worked finely and thinly, has a translucent element to it. Once fired and in the right light, it's almost like glass, and you can see the shadows of your fingers through the walls of the pot. I use trimming tools that have blades made from tungsten carbide. They're incredibly sharp, but they are quite brittle, which means I need to be very careful with them, as if a tool were to slide and drop onto the floor, the blade would just shatter or chip. These tools, specifically, the ones made by J.J. Lee, work far better on porcelain as opposed to stoneware, as not only can the grog in the stoneware chip the blade if they hit in the correct way, but the blade also tends to chatter on the stoneware, which is when the blade bounces across the surface as you trim and creates a very distinct pattern, which in some cases people utilise to their advantage, as the patterns it creates can be rather nice sometimes. But for these pots, I want as flat and clean a surface as possible, and I use a variety of tools to get to that point. And once I've trimmed away enough, I just use a flat-edged metal tool just to burnish the sides to ensure that they're nice and flat. And with porcelain, you can check the thickness with a torch, and albeit a little difficult to see here perhaps, you can see that I've got a thin spot on the waist, as the light only comes around periodically, so it's useful to check, as I know I don't need to trim any more away from this area. I then begin to turn away clay from the base section, which was thrown a bit thickly, so there's plenty to remove. Another thing that I tried to never do with these tools is to press them against the metal of the wheel. And the same goes for my hands, really. I read a comment recently where somebody told me that when they were learning to throw, they pushed their hands as they are centering the clay so firmly into the metal that it caused parts of their hands to bleed, which is obviously something that should never happen. So even when I'm throwing, and my hands look as if they're pressed against the metal of the wheelhead, in most cases they're usually just floating slightly above it, and they glide on a very thin layer of slip. Of course there are some clay bodies that are so coarse and rough with the grog they contain that it almost feels like throwing with sandpaper. They can leave you with wonderful fine textured surfaces, but they are a pain to work with, whereas porcelain like this is almost the opposite. It's completely smooth. Sometimes I do find myself missing a small amount of grog in the clay's body, some bite, some tooth. It certainly makes for a more tactile sensation when trimming, and with this buttery smooth porcelain, you just don't get that same sensation, as if sometimes I can't really feel what the tool is doing. It's a tricky concept to explain, but I'm sure potters who've worked with both materials will understand what I mean. As you can see, there are some slight wobbles on the rim of this pot. I'll be able to trim a lot of it true, but I don't mind if there are a few undulations here and there. As soon as it stops spinning, you literally can't perceive them. And fundamentally, I'm not trying to make pots that look completely perfect as if they were made in a factory. The human touch, be it left in the throwing or the trimming, is part of what makes handmade ceramics so attractive to me. And there's a balance, which I'm really trying to achieve, where the pots are precisely handmade and there's a high level of craftsmanship, yet they retain some sense of still being a handmade object. Once the rim has been trimmed, I take a simple flat piece of metal and scrape away some of the excess here before sliding the pointed section beneath the pot to separate it from the metal wheelhead. I then take the pot and carefully place it upside down back onto the wheel, making sure I don't place it onto any burrs of clay or specks of dirt that might embed back into the delicate rim. I then push 3 lumps of soft porcelain around the rim to hold it in place. This isn't the most elegant method, but it certainly works. If instead this was a form I was making many of, I would probably make a chuck that this would slot over, rather than trimming somewhat precariously with the pot only held down with 3 lumps of clay. But it does work, as long as I push down with enough pressure from above, pinning the pot down against the wheel. And that's exactly what I'm doing with the plastic spinner that's held in my left hand on the base of the pot. With this tool I can apply pressure that's distributed across the entire base, rather than it being focused in one spot, like it might be if I use my fingers. And in this position, I continue to trim the lower section of the pot. And when I'm ready, I can remove the spinner and begin to trim the base. I start by beveling this bottom edge, and this does 2 things. The first is it creates an edge that's far less likely to chip when it's placed down or moved around, as it's no longer a right angle, which would have a much sharper, more delicate edge that would be more prone to chipping with use. The other thing the beveled edge does is it creates an undercut beneath the pot, so that the pot itself casts a small shadow, and it makes a clear divide between the object and the surface it's placed on, as if it's hovering slightly above it. The band of shadow lets us know that the object isn't part of what it's being placed onto, whereas if you imagine an object that flows straight into the table and has, say, a sharp right angle around the base, then that object would look like it's connected to whatever surface it's placed onto. So in some ways the shadow beneath an object, I think, sort of invites you to pick it up and hold it, which is exactly what you want for a lot of handmade ceramics, especially functional objects. After the bevel's been trimmed, I spent some time turning the base to be totally flat. I want the bottoms of my pots to show the same level of craftsmanship as the rest of the vessel, and in some cases I think they should show even more. As well, the rest of this vase will be covered in glaze, which partially hides the claywork underneath. The base will remain as exposed clay forever, and I want people who pick them up and look at them to see that. And that's the vase finished. I will double check the rim just to make sure it's totally fine, and after a quick inspection, I'll set them aside very carefully onto a wearboard that's been wiped clean of any clay, just so nothing can embed itself back into the carefully finished base. And from this point on, I'll let them slowly dry out to bone dry before bisque firing them, glazing them, and gas firing them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.